Let's learn how to model using NURBS in 3ds Max. Now, if you've used Maya or Softimage or any other number of packages, you're probably familiar with NURBS because those packages rely very heavily on NURBS to create surfaces. Max isn't as NURBS-centric as a package such as Maya, and most people can get by just fine using polygons and maybe patches. Some people don't like modeling with NURBS because it seems too complex, which I don't think is true. Some people were put off by Max's initial implementation of NURBS, which has significantly improved at version 6. So there really is no reason not to use NURBS, and it's a great way to model all sorts of objects that have flowing surfaces and very curved surfaces. It's a very good way to control the curvature of a surface, and it's also just a great tool to have in your modeling arsenal. So let's learn a little bit about NURBS. NURBS stands for Non-Uniform Rational B-Splines, and what the key term in that is B-splines, and those are B-spline curves. Within Max's NURBS implementation, there are actually two different types of curves that we can use. Let's go ahead and start learning about NURBS by learning about the curves. We're going to go into our Create panel. We're going to go over to Shapes. And then there's a pull-down menu here that says NURBS Curves. Click on that. You'll find we have two types of curves. We have a point curve and a CV curve. I'm going to show you the difference between those. I'm going to highlight my front window and maximize it. And then I'm going to select point curve. I'm going to left click in the window and then just keep clicking every time I want to lay down a point. Right click ends creation. And that creates a surface that has a point curve. Now, let me show you what a point curve is. We're going to go over to the Modify panel. And as soon as we do, this little NURBS floater comes up. This is very different from a lot of other types of Max modeling, such as polygonal or spline modeling, where everything is contained in the rollout. This little floater gives you a lot of options here. But really what we want to do is just look at the curves at this point. If I go over to my modifier and I roll it out, we have two types of objects here. We have the point and we have the curve. Go to the point, we notice that, again, remember this is a point curve, and if I move these points, notice how the curve actually flows through the point. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a CV curve. So I'm going to go back over to my Create panel, which should bring up NURBS curves, and let's create a CV curve. Now this is a little bit different than the point curve. And we create it very much the same way. We left click and just start laying down points. But if you notice, these points don't sit on the curve. Now, if you've used Maya, you're probably very familiar with how this works. But indulge me while I go through and show you the difference. I'm going to go back over to the Modify panel. And here we have two different types of objects. Instead of point, we have curve CV and curve. Now the difference between a point curve and a CV curve is that the CV curve allows you to weight the points. So if I select a point here, I go over to my rollout, and I notice I have a weight spinner here. If I spin it up, it hardens the corner. So basically I can create very hard corners, which I can't really do easily with a point curve. And if I go down below 1, it starts really softening the curve to the point where when it's at 0, it pretty much has no effect on the curve at all. Now the default here is 1. I'm going to go ahead and put that back to 1. Now, just like with patch modeling, a NURBS subobject can actually contain many curves and many different surfaces. So I can create the curves in a number of ways. I can do it through the Create panel, or if I want, I can create curves directly within the NURBS subobject. So all I have to do here is go over to my little menu here. It says Create CV Curve, Create Point Curve, and so on. So if I wanted to create another CV curve, I just click there, and then just left click and draw it just like I did before. And now what that does is that gives me two curves within this one sub-object here. So I've got this curve and this curve. And if I want, I can actually give these curves names. I can hide, unhide, very much like you can with polygonal or patch type objects. Now if I want, I can also have multiple different types of curves. So for example, I can attach things just like I can with polygonal. So if I hit attach and click on that point curve I created, now I've got three curves within this one NURB sub-object. If you look, we've got curve CVs, we've got point curve, basically just calls them points, but those are kind of like CVs, control vertices. And then we've got the actual curves themselves. And then as we build things, you'll also have surfaces and surface CVs, which we'll get into. But let's talk about curves, and let's talk about points, and let's talk about how to create those. We've gone through creating a CV curve. We've created a point curve. The next one is called a fit curve. Now what a fit curve is it allows you to fit a curve to a series of points that you can create. Now you can create all sorts of different points. You can create points here on just out in the viewport, or you can create points that are offset to other points, or you can create points that are on a curve. Like for example, if I wanted, for example, this point here to be on this curve, this point to be on this curve, and so on and so forth, I can create points pretty much wherever I want. Now by creating a fit curve, what you're doing here is it allows you to create a curve that actually goes between all these different points. So it's fitting to these points. Now the cool thing about this is that these points here, these points on curve, are actually stuck to those curves. So for example, if I selected this CV and I moved it, that point is going to follow that curve, and this line, which is fit to these points, follows the curve as well. And so that can be very handy when you're modeling. Let's say you wanted to create the edges of a surface or something. You could very easily create some points on the curve that are at the very ends of these curves, for example, like this. And then you just create a fit curve here. And this could actually be the end of a patch or something like that. So if I go in and actually modify that curve, that will always stick to the end of that curve. So I could actually very easily create a surface. Now there's a bunch of other tools that we can use. I'm going to go ahead and actually delete this, and we're just going to draw one curve, and I'll show you how to work with this. So I'm going to go back over here, and I'm going to just create a CV curve here. And let's go ahead through some of these other tools. One that's very important is called a transform curve. And what that does is you click and drag on the curve, and it creates a curve that is actually transformed and is always a fixed distance away from the other curve at the same shape. So if I modify these CVs, that curve follows along. Now this is great. Let's say you're creating a car. It's beautiful for creating the seams in a car because you want the seams to be exactly 1/8 of an inch or something like that. You can totally do that, and you can modify one side panel of the car and everything else falls into shape. So that's really a handy sort of thing. And you can go back, and from the transform curve you can actually resculpt it and move it, and then it still works. Now this second curve here is what's called a relational curve. So that means that you really can't change the shape of it except by changing the shape of the originating curve. If you want, you can take this curve and you can do what's called make independent, which makes it its own curve that is no longer related to the original curve, or you can convert it, which does the same thing but also converts it into either a point or a CV curve. So, for example, if I created it into a CV curve, it becomes its own separate object now, and modifying the first one doesn't affect the second one. Now we have some other tools here. One's called an offset curve. Very similar to transform curve, and in that it gives you an offset, but it also changes the shape of the curve a little bit, as you can see, so that it actually is. So that's for, like, for example, if you have a window and you need to create an outline for a window or some sort of circular object, that really helps a lot with that. We also have what's called a mirror curve, and what that does is allows you to basically just mirror a curve with an offset. So this is the center here, this little yellow thing here, and we can offset it over any. So it's pretty much like the mirror tool up here, but within the NURBS object. But these are relational curves, so that's the one good thing about it is, so for example, if I take this curve CV of this one and I change it, my mirror changes. So we're going to be using this, for example, to create the left side of car from the right. That would be a perfect way of doing that. So if you wanted the fender to be identical but just mirrored, you can do it that way. And then you can also reshape the fender, and everything else kind of falls into place. Now we also have some other types of curves here. We have chamfer curves, which are for creating chamfers and fillets, like on boxes, that sort of thing. We also have what's called intersections, U and V curves. Now those are for curves that are on surfaces, and we'll get into those a little bit later. And we can also create what are called projected curves. Again, these are for curves that are actually fixed to a surface, and as we get into surfaces, we'll talk a little bit more about those. And we can also create CV and point curves on surfaces, and we can also create curves from the edges of a surface. So those are basically how you work with curves in NURBS. And let's go ahead and move on to surfaces, and we'll talk about how to turn a curve into a surface.